I just finished mixing and mastering this beat, so I figured I'd go through and run through the process. So the first thing I do when I'm mixing and mastering is I isolate one of the louder parts of the beat. So in this case, it would have been probably this section here. Well, I mean, more specifically, this section here with the 808 and the kick playing at the same time. But the reason I typically will isolate the loudest part of the beat when I'm mastering is because if you master the entire beat using a part of the beat that isn't the loudest, what's going to happen is you're going to try to bring those quieter bits up to get to the, the levels that you're looking for. But then when you play the entire beat back, once those louder parts come in, those are also going to be compressed by that same amount, and they're going to be over compressed. So to avoid over compressing a lot of your signals, what a lot of people suggest is you isolate the loudest part of the beat and then master it from there. And then once you're mostly done, let the whole thing play through just to make sure things sound good. And then I threw all my sounds on one mixer channel. So I've got all of my melodies here, I've got my 808s here, and then I have all of my drum sounds over here. So as you can see, I've got all these going to one place off to the right, and that place is here, the pre-master chain. So I've moved things around since the last time I recorded a video for this, just for like simplicity's sake. A lot of the same things are still here, they're just within Patcher. So the first thing in my chain for my pre-master chain is an EQ where I'm cutting the low lows as well as the high highs. I'm also kind of boosting the bass frequencies a little bit. So let's turn everything off, and then as we go through each thing, I will turn it on. So here's what everything sounds like without any effects on. Okay, and as you can see, we're going quite a bit above zero over here on the left. And so let's go ahead and turn on the first thing. So EQ. That automatically made it jump up in volume because I'm cutting the low lows. I'm also kind of boosting the bass, like I said. The next thing in my chain is a Patcher preset. And this Patcher preset is something I put together to kind of take the place of those 3 Maximus instances, because as you can see, I've got 3 instances of Maximus. I also have a mid-side EQ. So I took a lot of my mastering processes and I just kind of shoved them into Patcher, because you can do that. You can just put anything you want in Patcher. Patcher is so cool. If you haven't like messed around with Patcher, you definitely need to, because you can literally use one Patcher preset as an entire mixer channel with like essentially infinite slots instead of just like 10 or however many there are. So in each instance of Maximus, I'm doing essentially the same thing. I'm doing multi-band compression. So in this first instance of Maximus, here's what everything sounds like before the 3 different instances of Maximus. Okay, here's what it sounds like after. Okay, and in each instance of Maximus, like I said, I was doing essentially the same thing. It's just multi-band compression. So on this first instance of Maximus, this is my like extremes Maximus, where I'm working with extremes, so 50 hertz and below and 10K and above. What I like to do with my 50 hertz and below region is I like to make a little bit of an S-curve like this. So I'm boosting the louder stuff, and then I'm also doing the opposite with the quieter stuff. So I'm making this stuff a little bit quieter, because I don't know if you can see this, but there's a little bit of like residual sound just kind of bleeding through here between my kicks. And I don't necessarily want that at the 50 hertz and below range. And I'm also compressing a little bit. On the mids, I'm doing something similar, except I'm not, using the expansion tool here, but I am compressing in the highs as well, and I'm compressing on the master. So I'm compressing everywhere, basically. And as we go through these, I'll, do slightly different things, but for the most part, I'm doing the same thing. Oh, and something else, when I'm going through the mastering process with Maximus, I tend to compress a little bit more on the high end. And that's because I want my hats to kind of dominate that higher end instead of something else like a clap or a snare, which is why when I turned my Patcher preset on and off, if you listen to the clap, it actually sounds a little bit less like in your face. And that's because I shaved off, I compressed down some of that higher end from the clap. So listen to just the clap here. So now I'm going to turn it on. It's a lot less bright. It's still present and it's still loud. So in the second instance of Maximus, I'm doing essentially the exact same thing. Okay, there's really not anything different here going on. Let's go to the third instance of Maximus. Now in this one, I believe I'm doing something a little bit different. Yeah, in the third instance of Maximus, I did essentially the same thing. The difference is I soloed my mid band, and then I moved my bands in until I didn't really hear the kick or the 808 as much anymore, and then until I couldn't really hear the hi-hats anymore. Example, on this mid band, I'm using the expansion tool, kind of like I did with the 808 on the 50 hertz and below, and the purpose of this is to make that clap just pop out a little bit more in this middle region. So as you can see, I'm bringing up that clap. Okay, I'm also compressing just like before. And then as you can see on my high band, I'm compressing quite a bit more than everywhere else. And something else I'm doing on the high band here is I'm introducing a little bit of saturation. So I've got this saturation threshold at 1%. What I like to do is flip back and forth, because this has two types, type A and type B. And I like to flip back and forth between the two until I find the one that I like the sound of, and then I tend to mix it back to like 1 to 3% or so, which is kind of acting like a soft clipper in a way. So, and then on the master, I'm doing essentially the same thing. Now, the difference on the master is with this little node here. You can see I've got a node about as high as it will go, and you might not be able to see it, but this has a curve to it. So if I hover over this, if you look in the bottom right corner of the screen, you'll see 1.04%. I tend to shoot for like 0.9 something or 1 point something, just somewhere in there, just for consistency. And then I might push it a little bit louder later if I need to. In this case, I did push it a little bit louder because I normally start at 0.9. But the purpose of this is to bring the volume up of everything that's not the loudest. So if you were to like look at here, I'm just going to let this play for a second so we can see the waveform. But on the right, there's a green line going across the screen. Anything below that green line is being expanded, meaning it's being made a little bit louder. Okay, and the purpose of that is, well, to do exactly that, to bring up the levels and the volumes of everything that's not quite the loudest stuff. Okay, after my third instance of Maximus, I have a patcher preset, which is a mid-side EQ. And on the mid-side EQ, I'm doing a couple of things. So on the sides, I'm cutting the sub-bass frequencies, and I'm also boosting the bass frequencies a little bit. Okay, and then on just the mids, I've got a limiter and an EQ as well. On the limiter, I've brought the ceiling down by 0.5 decibels. So I'm limiting the signal down just a little bit. So yes, now I am experimenting with this part. I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to be doing this like long term, so I'm just kind of seeing how it sounds. For now, I like the way it sounds. At this stage, I used to also add a little bit of saturation, which you can do. So in this case, I don't think I'm going to add any saturation. And that is this patcher preset. It's got 3 Maximus presets, which are just doing essentially the same thing, multi-band compression, and then I've got a mid-side EQ. The next thing in my chain is another patcher preset, which I could add the stereo separation. So I'm taking the lows and putting them in mono. If you drag this all the way down, it will put your low frequencies completely in mono, and then I'm doing the opposite with the high frequencies. I'm pushing them out to the sides. You can also play with the middle bands to taste. Okay, so before these patcher presets, it sounds like this. And then with them, it sounds like this. Okay, so the next couple of things in my chain are a wave shaper and a limiter. The wave shaper is set to hard clip, and I'm also pushing 5 additional percentage of volume up into this hard clipper. And then I'm hard clipping off some of the signal on the top. And then because I'm clipping off a little bit of the signal on the top, on the limiter that comes after it, I'm boosting 0.3 decibels of volume. And I'm not actually limiting at all. So this is before. Here's after. Okay, so let's do a before and after for the whole chain. So here's before. Here's after. Okay, let's go to our master chain, where I've got a lot of the same kinds of processes going on. So I'm going to turn on my EQ, and on the EQ, what I'm doing is cutting the low lows. It's kind of redundant because I'm already doing this a bunch of other times, so it's probably not super necessary, but Then I have a compressor and a limiter. This compressor is usually started halfway mixed on and the gain is a little bit lower, but then if I realize that the track needs to be louder, I'll adjust the setting. But let's hear what it sounds like before and after these three sounds. So here's before. Here's after. Okay, the next thing in my chain is another patcher preset, which is messing with the stereo again. And then I have another Maximus preset, which is doing the same thing that I did in the third instance of Maximus before, where I soloed the midband. I used the same sort of expansion tool. And then I also added some saturation to the midband as well, just to the stuff that's louder on the top. Everything else seems to be mostly the same. And then I also added a little bit of saturation to the highs again. And then on the master, I did the same sort of thing. I pushed into the limiter a little bit, and then I also did the same sort of thing where I boosted everything that was not the very loudest. So I put a note about as high as it will go, but not all the way to the top. And then I arced this line up 1.3%, as you can see in the bottom right corner of the screen. Something else I'm doing at this stage is I'm pushing some volume after, so 2.2 decibels of volume are being pushed after this Maximus preset, and that's because of what comes after this. So what comes after the Maximus preset are a soft clipper and a limiter. So let's hear what this sounds like as is. So as you can see, I'm clearly going above 0 because I pushed some extra volume after the Maximus preset. So what I did after this was I turned on a soft clipper and a limiter. And then I used the Boolean loudness meter to tell me about how loud my track was. So let's listen to what it sounded like before Maximus and after Maximus. So we're actually going a bit above 0 here. So that's before, here's after. Okay, so let's listen before and after the master chain. So here's before the master chain. And here's after. Okay, so let's listen before and after all of the mastering processes turned off and my master chain is turned off. Here's what everything sounds like. As you can hear, everything's a lot quieter, and I'm also jumping way above 0. Like I'm getting up to like 3 decibels or louder. Okay, so let's turn on both of these. And that's how I mastered this track. So if you have any questions about any part of the process, feel free to let me know down in the comments. Also, if you have any suggestions for any videos you want to see in the future, feel free to throw that down in the comments. But yeah, let's let it ride.